So, why was there violence and intimidation at this point? How are they controlling these Soviets? They're putting their people in, but are they? First of all, they sound much more disciplined than any of their opponents. How are they cracking the whip and making sure everyone's doing what they're told? And are we starting to see the development of this tyranny, this violence that we associate with Soviet political control?
Yes, I mean, Lenin despised anybody who disagreed with him. He had to be fairly clever with dealing with some of his colleagues on the Central Committee. But basically, he became infuriated when he felt that people were just sort of cowards or idiots because they didn't see his point of view. Well, quite often he was right in the sense of what he wanted to achieve, not necessarily the others. Many of them thought that that he was almost mad in his wild, reckless optimism of being able to turn a complete society, especially one as reactionary, the Russia of icons and cockroaches, as Trotsky called it, to turn all of that upside down. But with his iron determination, Lenin managed to achieve all that. But he did have Trotsky, who was organizing very much more the military side. It wasn't Lenin doing that. That was Trotsky.
And so Trotsky is happy to put a bit of stick about, is he?
Yes, but he was a brilliant orator. There was no doubt about it, and he could be very funny indeed. No, he was a very, very clever man. But of course, like some clever men, he didn't look over his shoulder enough when it came to the way that they treated Stalin, who was, of course, never going to forgive him because he hated these Bolshevik intellectuals who regarded him as a pockmarked Georgian gangster.
He was a street fighter, wasn't he?
Yes. Well, and no, he was a bank robber as well. Yeah. Yes.
So you think you've got it bad, folks? So we've got Lenin seizes control. He's through these workers' councils. He's regaining some semblance of state. As you say, he's rebuilding these levers that he can pull. If he wants something to happen in Vladivostok, it's beginning to happen.
He definitely is rebuilding, if you like, the levers, but the levers are that it looks as if the Soviets are sort of democratic and voted in from below. But in fact, what they do is they make sure that actually the control really comes through the Bolshevik Party. And this is where they have this sort of almost parallel government, where, of course, the party is always going to control absolutely everything. So that is the way that they manage to transfer all of the power to the party.
But there is this important point. For example, you mentioned the sailors. These we now look back at them, we almost mythologized as rather noble, tragic figures. They're motivated, what, by just being paid, good food, good conditions, or is there still the importance of rhetoric and the idea of communism is inspiring to these people?
Oh, both. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there were some who were totally dedicated. What's intriguing is how many, particularly foreign communists or Bolsheviks, arrived in Petrograd and then in Moscow, longing to take part in this sort of great experiment, but acknowledged that it was an experiment and it was a reckless experiment, and they didn't expect to be there in power for long. But they felt, well, if we kill all the bourgeoisie now, at least we won't have to deal with them again in the future. So from that point of view, there was should we say, an irresponsibility of extraordinary degree.
So let's talk about killing people. We come on to sort of killing very large. When do we start killing very large numbers of people?
It doesn't really start until the earlier part of 1918, and this is with the introduction of the checker.
Whole weeks later.
Oh, months. Well, several months later, in fact. But although the checker is actually set up in December of 1917, i.e. just about a month after the November coup d'etat.
And this is sort of proto-KGB
This is proto-KGB, organized by this extraordinary character, Felix Dzerzhinsky, who was a Polish aristocrat who had been actually training for the priesthood, rather like Stalin. Actually, they both became sort of allies later, who then turned against religion ferociously. But he was a Robespierrean figure, in fact, that he was completely incorruptible. He would sleep on the floor wrapped in his greatcoat and without any heating in his office. He wouldn't have anything more than the most basic ration. But at the same time, he also wasn't like some of the later KGB or NKVD leaders who were absolute blood-curdling maniacs. He didn't have that sort of bloodlust, but at the same time, this sort of cold incorruptibility did produce the most terrifying organization. And there were obviously, up to 20,000 people soon joined him, who were prepared to, and they were given permission by Lenin, both to torture and kill, without any reference to a judicial authority.
And who are they aiming at first?
Well, basically, it is a class. In fact, in the very first words of his direction to Jarzynski in December, it's basically aimed entirely at the bourgeoisie. It is entirely class fixated, and you know that is when they bring in the instant death sentences and all the rest of it.
And that's so. Lawyers, people involved in the political process, thinkers, people that might any locus of opposition to this Soviet takeover.
Indeed, yes, and he talks about the bourgeoisie and their sort of corrupt intelligentsia and so forth. Anything which was sort of centrist, liberal, or whatever. The cadets, which were sort of basically as a sort of centrist party, centre right perhaps, they were sort of arrested and locked up or killed or whatever. And then, of course, it was the taking of hostages. So whenever there was a first attempt, for example, on Lenin's life in January when a couple of shots were fired at his car. But that was nothing in comparison to when later in 1918, in the summer, when both, first of all, in Petrograd, Uritsky, the head of the Cheka there, is assassinated in his office by a young cadet officer. And the same day, Lenin has 2 bullets fired into him by Fanny Kaplan, an anarchist who by then had joined the left socialist revolutionaries. And she put a bullet into his neck. And this is when you start to get the cult of personality, because the very fact of his survival was then treated in propaganda terms as if sort of, he was a sort of non-religious Jesus Christ. And
you get that lovely phrase there, he opened the jaws of terror, didn't he? And that's when it's just anyone connected with anyone who can be trumped up charges. Yeah. And that's when the number of people starts to go up.
Well, they literally started emptying the jails, just shooting people, right. As a warning, if you like, as an act, literally a deliberate act of terror to warn people against any form of opposition to the regime. That was the Red Terror, which of course was going to be very different to the White Terror, which came later.
I'm looking forward to that. So let's quickly finish off the First World War. I'm very fond of very small moments of levity in this catastrophic situation. I know. The peasant that they picked up on the way to Brest-Litovsk, they're going to meet the Germans at Brest-Litovsk. They stop the train, pick up the representative of the Russian people, a random peasant afield, and he then got involved in lots of drinking competitions against the German negotiators, didn't he?
Well, I mean, it's one of the most extraordinary stories. I mean, Brest-Litovsk, in fact, this treaty which the Russians, the communists, were forced to sign by the Germans, was actually the biggest German triumph of the whole of the First World War, because they were able to occupy basically the Baltic states, the whole of Belarus, and a large part of Ukraine, which saved the cities of Germany, of the German Empire, and of the Austro-Hungarian Empire from total starvation, and gave them the opportunity to transfer all of those troops to the Western Front for their great counterattack. But here we have, as Dan was saying, they wanted to have representatives. So when one talks about the representatives, they had one woman assassin who had been a socialist revolutionary and had killed one Grand Duke, I can't remember whichever. And then they had a soldier, and then they suddenly realized they had a sailor as well. And they suddenly realized, oh, we haven't got a peasant. And this is when they picked up this peasant they saw who was sort of trying to find his way home in Petrograd, in Moscow. So they scooped him up. He realized, actually, he was onto rather a good thing. He had to sort of mind his P's and Q's a little bit. And then when there was the big dinner given by Prince Luitpold of Bavaria, who was the commander-in-chief on the Eastern Front of the German forces, it was rather strange when you get the peasant who was immediately turned. He was sitting next to another German prince or whatever, and he turned to the waiter as he arrived with the wine, and who asked him whether he wanted red or white. And he said, which is the stronger?
But the Germans were rather taken with him, weren't they?
Well, I think they were, but I mean, he had this huge beard or whatever, and he was sort of forcing the food into his mouth. But it was, shall we say, an interesting contrast. But you also had then Karl Radek, who was sort of described as sort of rather as a sort of naughty goblin, who arrived at Brest-Litovsk throwing leaflets out of the window of the train, encouraging the German soldiers to mutiny against their own officers, which of course didn't go down terribly well with the German officers, as you might imagine.
So Germany, although it's always the trick question, everyone goes, oh, did Hitler not think about Napoleon invading Russia? Well, don't forget, Hitler was thinking about Russia in World War I. They won the war against Russia on the Eastern Front, World War I.
Well, absolutely, and this is why they had this obsession of feeling that if we can reoccupy all of that part of the great Black Earth regions, we will be impervious against any attack from the West.
Still talking about Ukraine's breadbasket. It's extraordinary, 100 years later. So Lenin has signed a brutal, humiliating peace with Germany. He doesn't really care. He's got quite a lot of, Soviet empire's quite big, so he can live without that bit for the moment. What's his priority? And when do we start to see proper organized resistance to his coup?
Well, there was isolated resistance in a lot of areas, particularly and here we are again, in the Donbass, in the area of the Don Cossacks, and to a certain degree in the Caucasus. But above all, it was the Don Cossacks who were rising up against the Soviet authority in the northern Caucasus and above all in southeast Ukraine. You have a certain amount of initial fighting also in Kiev itself, where the Ukrainian nationalists, led by Petliura, are trying to sort of set up their own sort of independent independent state. And this, ironically, again, is what Putin attacked Lenin for actually allowing the idea of self-determination. But actually, Lenin was being realized that sort of, we don't want to have a reputation as Russian chauvinists, so we'll pretend that we're going to allow them to have sort of self-determination. But of course, as soon as we have world revolution, they'll all be back under our control again anyway.
Yes, and actually, quite soon, Germany looks like it's teetering on the edge of Soviet.
Yes.
Well, there was Soviet set up, leftist revolution. So Lenin looked like, the plan's working quite nicely. I made a peace with the Imperial Germany, they don't exist anymore, and they're about to be...
Well, that was certainly what their great hope was, and this is why, when we eventually come to it, of 1920, the war with Poland, the idea there is to get your land bridge all the way through to Europe, hoping that you're going to still spread revolution right throughout Europe at that particular stage.
The Russo-Polish War, folks, one of my favourite episodes of 20th century history, much under talked about, but now featuring brilliantly in this book. We'll come to that in a second. So tumults within Russia. Yeah, talked about the opposition. When we got some Ukrainian nationalists, we got nationalists in the Baltics and things, but what about the so-called white forces? When do we start to emerge?
Oh, they're certainly emerging. I mean, you get a mixture. You have if you like, the moderate socialists, the right socialist revolutionaries, and they sound rather more radical than they really were, but they were basically moderate socialists, whose main support was, of course, in the Volga region, and who basically believed very much in bringing back the Constituent Assembly. Many of them were led by members who had been voted in, but had managed to escape the Bolshevik net and get to the Volga region. And this is where the fighting sort of started. Now, they, of course, were extremely vulnerable. They didn't really have any troops. But they were soon joined, of course, by the frustrated officers who were reactionary Tsarists in most cases. And then this extraordinary miracle, if you like, of the Czech forces. And this was what was actually going to turn it into a full civil war, because the Czechs, who were trying to get back to their homeland via the Trans-Siberian Railway.
Yes, you say, what are the Czechs doing here in...
Well, of course, this goes back to the First World War, because some Czechs were part of the Austrian army, some were part of the German army, and some of them were part of the Russian army.
I had to ask.
Yes, quite right. No, you were quite right.
Not much clarity, though. Okay, no, so they got... So these are Czechs who served with the Tsarist force and just want to get home now.
They wanted to get home, and those, for example, who'd been in the German or the Austro-Hungarian army had deserted whenever they could to join the Czechs on the other side in the Tsarist forces. And so a sort of Czech legion started to be formed. And so when it came to what they thought was going to be basically the end of their fighting, they arranged with the Allies, and the French wanted to bring them back so that they could actually then use them to fight on the Western Front. But Trotsky made a huge mistake, because he said, we've got to disarm these Czechs. He didn't trust them, and we've got to disarm them. And there were clashes with local Soviets, and then suddenly the whole of the line of the Trans-Siberian Railway, all the way to Vladivostok, sort of burst into action, with the Czechs basically fighting the local Bolshevik leaders.
So the Czechs they're taking the long way home.
They're taking a very long way.
They make Xenophon look like a day tripper.
Yes.
and so they fight their way along the length of Russia. But they know how to fight. So the whites they're a nucleus you can build a...
And of course, then you have the Cossacks, and of course the Siberian Cossacks were probably the most ferocious and savage of the lot. I mean, they were notorious. I mean, most frankly, appalling war criminals in most cases. And many of them were totally deranged. I mean, the Baron von Ungern-Sternberg, who was sort of basically a Buddhist who lived in Mongolia but was sort of fighting across the borders. I mean, some of these characters really were out of, frankly, out of some sort of terrifying fantasy.
And the Cossacks were, how might we say, paternalistic. Like they weren't wooed by socialist ideas of equality.
No, they weren't very cuddly at all. No, I mean,
they were quite happy with a traditional aristocratic-led sort of.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, there were left Cossacks too. I mean, some of them.
Of course,
the Red
there
Cossacks.
were. I mean, it's the Russian Revolution. Again,
you've got to have some in that particular way. But they were very much used then later by the Reds, because suddenly the Reds realized that they were at a disadvantage, even though they had a lot of troops. The sheer size of the landmass meant that you needed cavalry and trains. And so basically it was a cavalry and a train war over these vast distances. And so you started to see these wonderful posters going up saying proletarians to horse. Well, you can imagine, many of the proletarians, of course, had never been on a horse in their lives. And I think they found it rather difficult. So that was why they started recruiting sort of Red Cossacks, who were the poorer Cossacks, or the Inguronie, who were the local Russians who had been rather repressed by the Cossacks in their own major areas.
What we all learn about the whites, don't we, is that they were let down by the fact that there was no equivalent of Lenin and Trotsky, an extraordinary focus of power. Yes. And authority within the Red movement. How disparate are the anti-government? Is it right to think of them as sort of one white group, or is it just a sort of disparate bunch of enemies of the regime?
It's a very disparate bunch. As I say, the main split was really between the moderate socialists, who were anti-Bolshevik, and would never forgive them for having destroyed the Constituent Assembly, allied with these appalling reactionaries who were more interested in beating up the peasants who'd taken over the estates, who were usually totally corrupt. There was no civil administration of any form, really, and they just used any opportunity to enrich themselves. In many cases, especially towards the end of the war, when it was obvious they were going to lose, simply to sort of try and get up a bank balance ready for exile.